On a rainy day in February, I met Portlander Charlene Brown.
I've been here since July 31st. They opened on Tuesday, I think, and I came in on the next Monday.
For more than 6 months, she'd been living at Clinton Triangle, a large outdoor homeless shelter owned by the city of Portland, made up of rows of 160 10-by-10 sheds converted into sleeping pods. Brown has a wonderful laugh. She loves to cook, taking recipes and making them her own. Residents here don't have access to kitchen space, but when we met, shelter workers were helping her bake a pie in the staff kitchen.
So after I'm done with here, I'll be able to have some cherry pie.
Friends she's made at Clinton Triangle feel like family, and she loves her roommate, Charlie the dog.
She's got a loud bark, but she's all bark, no bite. You asked her if she had anything to say. She's got nothing but
But Brown's had hard times here too. A few months back, she accidentally OD'd after taking meth laced with fentanyl. She was revived by shelter staff with the overdose reversal drug naloxone. It took 6 doses.
I felt like I just woke up from a nap. I came to and being told the words Narcan and died, and I just remember crying, saying, I don't understand. And as I'm feeling this pain in my chest and I'm seeing everybody stand around and the ambulance getting there,
The experience changed her life. She's been sober ever since. And she says the support she's gotten from shelter staff and friends has helped her stay clean. She knows she doesn't want to die. But living around other people who are still using, it's not always easy.
Because they always tell you, the first thing you learn is you got to change your people, places, and things. Well, how about when you get clean and you can't change people, places, and things? I'm living in the place where I OD'd. I'm freaking surrounded by the people that are using, and I can't make them stop.
She's been excited about taking the next step, getting into sober housing, having a real roof over her and Charlie's heads.
I just can't wait to use a kitchen and maybe go to the bathroom without having to worry about freezing my butt off.
When we met, she was on a waiting list, and she's not alone.
I'm just nervously waiting for the answer.
On last week's episode, we heard about a case before the U.S. Supreme Court out of Grants Pass, Oregon. If you missed it, go back and check it out. But basically, the case centers around this question. Can cities criminalize unsheltered homelessness if there's no other place for them to go? In Portland, theoretically, Clinton Triangle is supposed to be one of those other places to go. And that's important to the city if it wants to be able to enforce its camping ban policy. A large, low-barrier outdoor shelter like Clinton Triangle is supposed to be the city's model for how to provide shelter to chronically homeless Portlanders. It's meant to be a temporary stop on the path to permanent housing. But like Charlene Brown, some residents have been waiting for that next stop for a long time. At a moment when so much about homelessness is in flux in Oregon and nationwide, we wanted to zero in on this one shelter in Portland and ask, what's working about it? What isn't? And what does the story of Clinton Triangle say about the future of how Portland treats its unhoused residents? OPB Portland City Government reporter Alex Zielinski has gotten to know some of the people who've lived and worked there, and she's here with me today to help us answer these questions. I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB about the place you call home. So, Alex, what made you decide to report on Clinton Triangle? What was your way in with this story?
So it seems like forever ago, but there was a lot of drama around the shelter opening.
Yeah.
It was originally supposed to hold up to 500 people and only offer tents, which caused a lot of concern in members of the homeless community and their advocates and members of the public in general. People were comparing them to refugee camps. Governor Tina Kotek also didn't like this plan, and the city was really relying on her to help fund them. So Mayor Wheeler changed course to introduce a pared-down proposal with actual buildings instead of tents and only about 200 people in each of these shelters. So The plan was to open about 6 of these shelters, and Clinton Triangle was going to be the first. So I was just naturally drawn to the rollout of the first shelter and its success. And I first heard about how things were going last fall when I got a call from a woman who had lived there since it opened in July. I'm not going to use her real name because she's a victim of domestic violence and asked me to protect her privacy. I'll call her Maria for this story. So Maria called me to share some concerns with how the program was running. And there wasn't great food service. She wasn't getting help with healthcare needs. Nothing that she considered major, but enough that she wanted someone to be keeping tabs. And so she'd call me every few weeks. Sometimes she'd say things were going really well, that staff were helping her. Other times she sounded pretty depressed about her chances of moving out and leaving homelessness behind for good. Our conversations led me to reach out to more people living there. So I began to kind of collect different perspectives.
What was the city's rationale in pitching these large outdoor shelters in the first place?
At the time, the idea was that their existence could rationalize the city's plan to ban public street camping, since it would allow the city to say, well, we have these camps you can move into instead. And Portland and other West Coast cities and their governments aren't allowed to impose public camping restrictions unless they have enough shelter space to accommodate its unhoused population. And so being able to open up quickly kind of these larger encampments and pairing that with the potential camping ban made sense to Wheeler and City Council.
We can better connect homeless Portlanders to state and county services by consolidating those critical services in a number of large-scale sanctioned sites. This will be paired with a phasing in of a citywide ban on self-sited, unsanctioned encampments.
And so Clinton Triangle is being run by an organization called Urban Alchemy, which has also worked in other West Coast cities. Can you tell us a little bit about who they are? And, what is their approach to operating shelters like this one?
They're a California-based organization that runs similar shelters to Clinton Triangle in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Austin. It's only 6 years old. It's a company that's grown very quickly. It's had a bit of a rocky start.
Urban Alchemy has been the target of numerous lawsuits, alleging civil rights violations, physical and sexual harassment, and accusations of wage theft from staff. Urban Alchemy has settled most of these lawsuits out of court and denies any wrongdoing. But the city thought they'd be the right folks to run Portland's new outdoor shelter program because of their past experience running shelters like it in other cities. It's also worth noting that at the time these shelters were proposed, several local nonprofits that provide shelters in Portland and Multnomah County already turned down the opportunity to run Clinton Triangle. Like others, they had concerns about the size of the camps and the stigma surrounding them, which opened the door to Urban Alchemy.
Their focus is really on building a place for people to prepare to take the next step into permanent housing or work or whatever comes next. We met with Kirkpatrick Tyler, who is Urban Alchemy's Chief of Community and Government Affairs, a few months ago.
On the street, you're just in a perpetual cycle of death, physical death, emotional death, spiritual death. Mm-hmm. When we create spaces where people can safely work through their experience and have a support system that can connect them to what's next when they're ready for what's next, I think we'll continue to see success.
And, as much as Urban Alchemy is a homeless service provider, it also has another big focus, which is creating jobs for people who have lived experience with addiction and homelessness and incarceration. Most of Clinton Triangle's employees are people with those backgrounds.
One of the people we met who works at Clinton Triangle is Tashina Adams. As a care coordinator, she works one-on-one with about 20 residents of the shelter. She says her own experience with homelessness helps her be better at her job. It means a lot to people that they know she's been there. It's been a good job for her. She's moved up the ladder. Before this, she'd gotten certified in peer support and recovery mentorship.
Urban Alchemy came to town, and I was like, oh man, that seems like a great way to kind of use that certification and work my way up in a company that's brand new. But before that, I was just doing Subways and, bottom of the barrel jobs, I guess you could say.
She's the one who showed Alex and me around the shelter. Inside, there's offices and cubicles for support staff, centered around a kind of living room for the residents in the middle, with couches and a TV.
And one day all of this will be yours.
Outside, there's 160 white sleeping pods. They all look the same. They're lined up in rows that the shelter has given street names from historically Black Portland neighborhoods. On walls and signs around us are Urban Alchemy core values, one-word affirmations like integrity and self-discipline. It's a big space. We stroll past the dog run. The shelter has 34 dogs living there and 4 cats. Bathrooms are in 3 repurposed shipping containers with 4 or 5 bathrooms apiece and a laundry room attached.
So it's like, just like you'd have at home. It has a toilet in it, a sink in it, a shower in it.
The shelter also offers some long-term storage space. There's no kitchen for residents to use, but Adams says they provide ready-made meals to folks. We check out an empty sleeping pod. A heater has it nice and cozy inside.
The walls are light, so I feel like it helps bring in kind of a light feeling to the room. An air conditioner for hot nights, a heater for cold nights. There is obvious electricity and charging ports. There's shades to cover the windows. The windows open. You can open the screens even if you want more of a breeze.
Pods have shelves and underbed storage to stash your stuff, too.
I think they're super snazzy.
While this one happened to be empty, Adams says pods are rarely open for long. They're in high demand. When someone moves out, there's usually someone new, already set to move into their space.
Our intention is to stay full at every moment, or else what are we doing? You know what I mean?
So Clinton Triangle is a low-barrier shelter in several ways. For example, they allow pets like Charlene's dog Charlie. Also, sobriety is not required to live there. And that really sets it apart from some other shelters with many more rules for residents. Alex, why is that distinction important when it comes to serving folks who are chronically homeless?
It can be a really big deal in the work to get people living outside onto a clear path to housing. Because, if someone wants help, but they're told that they have to get rid of their dog or go cold turkey on a drug that they're addicted to, that's a huge disincentive.
Yeah.
That keeps a lot of people from even considering help. The idea behind shelters like this is to create a space where people are willing to set foot and feel welcome, whatever that means for them. So that could be, allowing them to stay there with their partner or, allowing them to bring in things with them. That doesn't mean that there's just kind of rampant drug use. I should clarify here, people will be told to leave if they're using drugs or if they drink in public in the shared spaces of the Clinton Triangle. And they'll also be kicked out if they try to sell drugs to other residents. But they aren't penalized for drinking or using drugs in the privacy of their sleeping pods, unless it leads to violence against another person or some other kind of crime. And that's a big deal, especially for folks who are addicted, and it's not easy to just stop once you're moving into another place. A problem with people using drugs in the privacy of their own little sleeping pods, though, is that no one may notice if they overdose, and that's why staff at the Clinton Triangle, regularly knock on people's doors to conduct what they call wellness checks. This is a system that has led to staff reversing dozens of overdoses at the shelter. They say no one has died from an overdose there, which is pretty significant compared to the number of ODs that take place in the streets or in more isolated areas.
So by lowering the barriers of entry for people at this shelter, they're also saving lives. This model can also be described as harm reduction. That's a term you might have heard for programs that reduce the negative and often deadly consequences associated with drug use, like syringe exchange programs that distribute clean syringes to folks who need them, or people who distribute the overdose reversing medication naloxone. Leaders at Urban Alchemy have been hesitant to call what they do at Clinton Triangle harm reduction.
Harm reduction is a very specific thing that has very specific elements, right? We're just not othering and criminalizing people for challenges that they have. And we're not making them homeless because they're struggling in addiction.
Still, there are some similarities to the principles of harm reduction, the idea of meeting people where they are. For one, Charlene told us that she's been able to get sober at the shelter, but that is challenging sometimes. Alex, did you get a sense of how the shelter's approach to drug use and addiction has been good or bad for other folks staying there?
Yeah, it really depends on the people. They all have really different experiences staying there. There were a number of folks that I spoke with who had a substance addiction who said they felt much safer using at the shelter than on the streets. That's because they know staff are looking out for them in case they overdose, but also because they feel less vulnerable to just kind of drug-related crime while living in the shelter. Some people told me stories about getting beat up or robbed while living outside. It's worth pointing out that not everyone I met with who lives at the shelter is focused on immediately getting sober, but they are all still looking out for their safety. Charlene was the only person I spoke with at the shelter who was able to get sober and stay sober while living there. Many people living there, were really interested in getting sober. I mentioned Maria earlier, the woman who first called me from Clinton Triangle. One of her biggest motivators to move out of the shelter is to get off drugs. She doesn't think that's possible at Clinton Triangle.
I don't want to be living like this forever. I can't get clean here. No way. Drugs are everywhere here.
For a little bit more context on this, I called up Avik Chatterjee. He's an addiction medicine physician at Boston University who focuses on treating people experiencing homelessness. He said that it's really challenging for people experiencing homelessness to get off drugs if they're still in the same place they were when they were using before.
Someone's been in a shelter or on the street for a long, long time. They manage to stop using, whether it's out of willpower, help with medications, help with counseling and groups. And they're still in the same setting, and they're contemplating sobriety in a very depressing, degrading, demoralizing space. This is something I see a lot.
How else did residents that you met feel about just the day-to-day environment there?
Yeah, it can really change based on the week. I think I mentioned earlier how Maria had been frustrated with getting connected to mental health care and other services. That's come up from a number of folks. And then there's also concerns about the meals, the food. People get one meal a day, dinner, and then snacks and access to other foods during the day. But there's usually just one choice when it comes to dinner and not a lot of diversity in the foods they get. I hear that they're having the same exact meal maybe every day of the week for weeks on end. And I heard a lot of complaints about that. It's one of the reasons why a volunteer organization called Flash Grab started setting up outside of the Clinton Triangle once a week to offer kind of a variety of free food and supplies to folks who live inside. I spoke with Kina Lynn Muir, who founded Flash Grab, about why that feels necessary.
Psychologically, it's important that folks are able to be individuals and make choices for themselves, because how are they going to be expected to do those things on a grander scale of rather than what you want on your sandwich, but more like, what kind of job would I like, or what, where do I want to live? What are my goals? You know what I mean?
One of the biggest goals of this shelter model is to help transition people into a permanent home. Coming up after a short break, how Clinton Triangle residents have fared on their path to housing. This shelter is meant to be a launching pad for people to get into housing and ideally remain stable there. But like we heard, some people have lived there for months and months waiting for an opportunity to get into housing. Why has hooking up Clinton Triangle residents with housing been a struggle?
It's a great question, especially because we're always hearing about how the region has a lot of money to use for housing and homelessness.
Right.
The problem is a lot of this money is already promised to certain programs and isn't very flexible. It's also hard to get out the door quickly due to contracts and staffing issues. In the case of Clinton Triangle, it was promised a chunk of funding from the governor's office to specifically pay to move people out of shelter into housing when they're ready. That money would pay for a year's rent for people and come with support from a social worker to ensure that they were getting the care and support that they needed to eventually help them be financially stable enough after a year to stay housed. But all of that money dried up in January of this year. So suddenly, people at Clinton Triangle were told that they weren't going to be able to move anywhere, at least until more money appeared out of who knows where. That was the case for months, and it really caused a lot of anxiety within the people living there. So in April, the city got a chunk of money from the county to cover housing placements for about 50 more people or couples ready to leave Clinton Triangle. But there's no plan to keep funding that long term.
There's not nearly enough housing support. There's not nearly enough appropriate housing. We need more investment to help people kind of continue to move into housing. And, right now we still have thousands of people who don't even have shelter, not to mention those that are in shelter now needing that support. So it's going to take a longer investment.
That's Brandy Westerman, who oversees the Clinton Triangle program for the city. The concern is that if there's not a through line to move people into housing from the shelter, there's going to be a backlog of people living on the streets, ready to move on, but with nowhere to go. There are people who have made it into housing from Clinton Triangle. Michael Jones arrived at the shelter last August, not long after it had opened.
They were telling me, they said, this is temporary. They said, we'll help you find housing. That's getting programs and doing this kind of.
After a couple months, some funding became available, and he went to check out a potential new place to live in Northeast Portland.
Me and two mentors came here, and they were like, wow. I was like, wow. I said, I gotta have this.
In November, he moved into his own furnished studio apartment, where he's been ever since. His rent is covered for 1 year. It's allowed him to focus on other things.
Right now, like I said, I just, I'm going to school, and I'm working part-time now, like 2 or 3 days out of the week, so.
And he's getting support from a local alcohol recovery program and working on his sobriety.
And I go to their meetings, so, I got 3 or 4 different mentors I talk to a lot. And I communicate with them. Everybody says I'm doing so good, so.
So, Alex, it is great to see his success getting into a place and staying there for months now. And he definitely told you he wants to stay there. Beyond this one person, do we know very much about whether Clinton Triangle residents who have gotten hooked up with housing have stayed housed?
We really don't know. The city isn't tracking whether people who move out of the shelters stay housed for long after. They could be there for a weekend or they could be there for months, like Michael. There are some nonprofits that help run the housing programs that actually track this for their clients, but it's not the totality of Clinton Triangle residents. So we have kind of a sliver of data. Westerman with the city said it's important information to have.
I don't think we fully solved for how to make sure that we understand fully whether that exit to housing is a long-term stabilization or if that's a temporary state.
I have heard from a few people who have returned to homelessness after being placed in housing through Clinton Triangle, but it's so hard to know how common that is without the hard data.
Right. Something you heard about from advocates and shelter workers you talked with is trust, not breaking vulnerable people's trust. In that sense, what is at risk when people are existing within a system that is not working the way it's supposed to for them?
Yeah. So, as an example, just think about people who move into the Clinton Triangle and being told that they would be able to move into housing, within a few months. And then they learn that all of the money for that program is gone. It just feels like the rug is ripped out from under them. It's a big reason why people experiencing homelessness sometimes don't accept help in the first place, since they've been promised help in the past and it fell through. Losing that trust is a really big deal. Kirkpatrick Tyler at the Clinton Triangle, he takes that seriously.
How do we keep the availability of housing on track with people's readiness to go into housing, right? That's actually one of the things that creates what folks that we've labeled hard to serve or service resistant, because they had been a part of a system and they did all the things and they checked all the boxes, they went to all the meetings, they got sober, they did mental health, and then the prize at the end of the road was supposed to be housing, and it wasn't there.
In a way, the Clinton Triangle could be adding to this damage and creating more people who will turn away help if they aren't able to offer residents what they've been promised.
So the Evergreen listeners heard last week about the Grants Pass case before the Supreme Court and how this case could change things for homelessness policies across the country. What could this ruling mean for Portland?
So if the Supreme Court rules in favor of Grants Pass, that would mean, all cities can legally penalize people who are sleeping or resting on public property. But that doesn't mean Portland would immediately be able to do that. The city would still have to follow a state law that enshrines the federal ruling that Grants Pass case overrules, which requires that cities establish rules that allow for public camping if there isn't shelter space available. So that state law would still be in place, and it would basically just be up to state lawmakers to decide whether or not to undo that law and let cities like Portland start punishing people for sleeping outside or, just not having a house. I do want to go back to the city's own policies around camping. A lawsuit stopped the city from rolling out its own camping ban last year. Well, in early May, the city passed an updated version of that policy, one that they hope won't face legal challenges. This rule really just upholds a state law. It, allows for public camping unless there is shelter available for someone to relocate to. And in Portland, that's really rare. So we're a ways away from creating enough shelter to make that policy enforceable.
We're in a city where so many people have very strong feelings about homelessness and how it's being addressed. In this moment, what do you hope people take away from your coverage of Clinton Triangle?
Yeah, I think Portlanders are used to the city or the county's programs put in place to respond to homelessness just failing or falling short, to the point where we kind of expect them to fail. And I'm one of those people. I'm kind of a cynic. And I think it would be easy to see what's happening in Clinton Triangle and say it's just another example of the government program missing the mark and adding to the cycle of homelessness. But I think it's important to remember that people are also getting help and getting housed through this program. And, in the most basic sense, they aren't dying. Mm-hmm. People's lives are being saved. They're getting a second chance or a third chance at a future. And I think that's worth celebrating. It's also worth pointing out that there's been some recent research on outdoor alternative shelters like Clinton Triangle. Researchers at Portland State University put out a paper last month that found that tiny home village shelters like Clinton Triangle and others are way more cost-effective and flexible than traditional congregate shelters and are also really more effective at moving people into permanent housing. It finds that people who go into mass indoor shelters are far more likely to return to homelessness. So you may remember that for years, the city avoided investing in these kinds of shelters because they were new or unknown. We'd usually just see groups of people experiencing homelessness kind of band together and establish their own tiny home villages like Right to Dream 2 or Hazelnut Grove. These are models that are inspired and embraced by our own homeless community. So I think it's good news to see the city investing in more of these shelters that appear to be really helping people. It's a sign of growth.
Mm-hmm. Well, Alex, thank you so much for being here today and for bringing me along to the shelter with you.
Yeah, thank you, Jen.
Alex Zielinski is OPB's Portland City Government reporter. For more of her coverage of how the city addresses homelessness, visit opb.org. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. Join us next week as we explore the stories of a class of students OPB has been following since kindergarten on their way to high school graduation. As senior year approaches, what are the challenges facing Oregon students? OPB's Class of 2025 project continues. That's next time. If you're here listening right now, you are a part of our brand new podcast family. Help us grow by leaving a review on your favorite podcast app. Hit that follow button and hey, tell your friends. This episode was produced by yours truly. Our technical director is Stephen Cray. Nalene Silva engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Mia Estrada, Julie Sabatier, and Sage Van Wing. Alex Zielinski and I did the interviews you heard. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. If you have a question for us, hit us up. We love to hear from y'all. Send us an email at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.